Okay, so picking back up where we left off before. And our types of schedules. So fixed ratio schedule, we talked about after producing a certain number of products, you then get paid. An example of this for our dog would be if we set a fixed ratio of 3 schedule. This means that every 3 times they sit following us giving the cue, we then give them a treat. So it requires exactly 3, never 2, never 4, exactly 3 responses until they actually get the treat. One thing about fixed ratio schedules is that as you get sort of thinner and thinner, and typically much thinner than what we expect with our laboratory rodents, and up, we get a very particular pattern of responding, which is what we call a break and run response. So here you see very little of that break and response, but as the response requirement gets higher and higher that they have to engage in lots of responding, you see a very, 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 very fast, rapid period of responding so that they get all 185 out of the way. And then they get their reinforcer. And then what you see here is this post-reinforcement pause. So there's this long period of time in which they do nothing. And then all of a sudden, tons of responding and then nothing. Tons of responding, then nothing. Tons of responding, then nothing. And this is a break and run pattern. It's quite common within fixed ratio schedules. It's quite common probably within our own behavior. When there are a variety of things in which we have to engage in X number of things or a certain number of things before we can move on to until we get our reinforcer, and we have to keep doing it sequentially and sequentially. It's quite common that after you get your reinforcer, after you get paid, or after you get whatever it was that you were working towards, you just sit back and relax and say, I'm not going to start again until next week. Right? Or after an exam, you've studied, you get paid. And then you're like, I'm not going to do anything for a period of time. So it's that post-reinforcement pause that you get right after delivery of reinforcer for a certain phase of work. And it's quite common both across all species and is a typical behavioral phenomenon of these types of schedules. So you have pause, run, reinforcer, pause, run, reinforcer, pause, run, reinforcer. This is quite specific under a fixed ratio schedule. Once the animal learns that there will always be a reinforcer delivered after X number of responses. As the ratio size increases, so the more work you've got to do, the more you take a pause before restarting. So if you have a really long terminal run before a reinforcer, you take a long pause until you start that effort again. If it was much shorter, then that pause tends to be less substantial. And you can see that this pause and run pattern is still in here, but substantially less than what you see in this pattern. And it's because they're getting reinforced so much more frequently that it's worth just keep going, get your reinforcer, keep going, get your reinforcer, keep going, get your reinforcer. Whereas here, it's like I gotta go a lot before I get the next reinforcer. And we call this the post-reinforcement pause. Variable ratio schedules would be similar to the fixed ratio in that you still have to engage in a certain number of behaviors, but that number that's required before delivering the reinforcer is highly variable. So if you ask your dog to sit, sometimes the first time they sit, you give them a treat. Sometimes the 6th time they sit, you give them a treat. It's just constantly changing and highly variable. So that's what we call a variable ratio. A real life example of this is going to be a slot machine, right? You don't know which time you put your money in and push the button, you're going to get 1 or you're going to win. It's going to be highly variable, but it's going to depend on how many times you do it until you get paid for that. As you can imagine, especially with slotting machines being the example, these tend to generate very high response rates. So extremely high response rates, they're quite consistent. For the most part, in the early 2000s, late 90s, all of the sort of game producers and producers of like video games or computer games and the different like Facebook app games, things like that, they thought they had discovered something incredible, new behavioral phenomenon of sort of random reinforcement for games to get users to continue playing and keep their engagement up on these types of games. And essentially all of the games were programmed that way. Maybe some realized, but essentially this had been knowledge that had been known since the 1940s, but has been leveraged in pretty much all of the video games that are available now. The frequency at which different types of reinforcers come in a game are programmed specifically by a variable ratio schedule. So it depends on how frequently you're playing, and that those reinforcers are delivered under some type of variable schedule rather than a fixed schedule, because this substantially increases your playing time on them. And you can think of a lot of the things that engender a lot of responding for you are probably going to be under some type of variable ratio schedule. Under these schedules, that pause and run pattern that we just saw are going to completely disappear. We don't see those anymore because you never know when the next reinforcer is going to be. It could just be the very next time. So as you can imagine, these types of schedules can be highly addicting in a sense that, you know, you could get your slot machine win the very next time you put something in, or it could be 10,000 times, or it could be the next time, but it's because it could be the next time. It can generate a lot of responding on these schedules. So fixed interval schedules, there aren't as many great examples of that, but one example would be pressing a button for a particular pain medication or taking Tylenol and following a particular schedule, right? You can follow it every 4 hours. You can get the medicine every 4 hours, but nothing more, nothing less. And the first time you take it after that time being elapsed, you get your sort of reinforcer or relief from whatever that stimulus is. And so in that case, it's being scheduled by a fixed, it's a specific period of time. It's the first response you make after that time has elapsed, would be a variable interval schedule. So an example would be if you give your dog a treat, when he sits the first time after every minute. So it doesn't matter what he's doing from second 0 to 59, but the first time he sits after 60 seconds would deliver a reinforcer. You can imagine these types of schedules are very infrequently leveraged in dog training, but nonetheless, they do generate important and predictable behavior. So it's worth learning about. So this pattern of predictable behavior that they generate is what we call a scallop pattern. So as you can see here, there's kind of a, let me get my drawing here, a scallop. So I say scallop like I know what that means, but I can only think of the sea scallop, and I don't necessarily know what that is. This kind of curved little thing is what we call the scallop. I'm not totally sure why, I should probably look that up, but nonetheless, we call it scalloping. And it's basically where you get no response, no response, no response, more frequent, more frequent, more frequent response. The reason you get this is kind of imperfect timing, right? If you had a watch, then it would look more something like nothing, 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 timer goes off, you make a response, nothing, 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 timer goes off, you make a response. But because the animals have imperfect timing, as you get closer and closer to that period of time where the reinforcer is available, you get more and more responding. So very, very little, and then more and more frequent responding, very, very little, more and more frequent responding. And then every time right after reinforcer, you know that the next one's not coming for a little while, so you almost never respond. And then it's sort of like, has it been time? Has it been time? Has time elapsed? Has it been time yet? Has it been time yet? No. And you just keep checking. So we call this positive acceleration. And it produces this particularly unique behavioral pattern on that. Pauses, just like our fixed ratio schedules, will increase with interval duration as well. So next are going to be our variable interval schedules. So these are schedules in which it's going to only be the first response after a certain period of time is reinforced. It doesn't matter if you do it 10 times or 100 times. It's not going to change things. And so a real life example of this is that, the principle between, your obsession for checking after you make a post on Facebook, or I use Facebook, but apparently that's not cool anymore. Instagram, I guess, I don't know if that's cool anymore. I don't know, do you get likes on Snapchat, TikTok, whatever? Anyway, the point is that when you post something, there's a unpredictable but variable period of time until the likes start rolling in. And it doesn't matter if you check it 10, 20, 30, 40 times, that's not going to increase the probability that you're going to get a like, except that the likes are just coming in on this independent time schedule. And it's the first time you check it after a variable period of time that you get the reinforcer of, oh man, ooh, I got another like, ooh, I got another like. So that would be a variable interval schedule. And the same would be for a dog, that they don't know how long that time interval elapsed because it changes from trial to trial. But the first behavior they engage in after that interval has elapsed gets reinforced. So as you can imagine, this is going to be close to our variable ratio schedule in that it produces more consistent patterns of behavior. It's not going to be as fast as a variable ratio, because a variable ratio, it actually depends on how much behavior you engage in, as in how many reinforcers you get. Here, it's not going to matter how many times you check Facebook. It's not going to get you more likes, right? The likes are coming in time dependent, not how many times you check dependent. But nonetheless, this will create substantially higher response rates than if you had a fixed interval base. So for example, if you wanted to change your pattern of behavior such that you weren't constantly checking throughout the day, you could perhaps have things scheduled such that your Facebook checks or all of your sort of likes or all of your certain things come in at a specific time that's fixed. So every 3 hours, Facebook is available to you for checking. You would then produce a scallop pattern like what we saw here, such that as you get closer to 3 hours, you'd be like, is it ready yet? I don't know. But essentially outside of that 3 hour period and immediately after a 3 hour period, you'd have almost no time spent on your phone, because you know that you're not going to be able to get any updates from Facebook until that certain period of time. But because it's scheduled on a variable basis, you can get those updates at any time and you don't really know when. It generates a pretty consistent pattern of behavior. Not as high as if it was going to be a variable ratio, but still nonetheless a pretty high rate of behavior. And so as you would imagine on these schedules, there's little to no pausing. So this is the overall summary of the typical patterns. I would suggest that you be able to recognize and be able to define each of these types of schedules of reinforcement and each of these patterns of behavior that it produces. So fixed ratio is going to give you a break and run pattern. Variable ratio is going to give you the highest rate of behavior. Variable interval is going to give you an intermediate level of behavior, but it's going to be consistent. And a fixed interval is going to give you the scallop kind of pattern. Another important terminology, especially as we get to extinction, is going to be what we call rich versus lean schedules. So rich schedules are going to be high rates of reinforcement, meaning that you get them very, very frequently. So an FR2 versus an FR100, the FR2 means every 2 times you get something is going to be a really high rate of reinforcement. Whereas if it took 100 times to get something, it would be what we call a lean schedule of reinforcement. It would take a lot of behavior until you get a reinforcer. So an FR1 in this case would be a rich schedule, whereas an FR1000 would be what we call a lean schedule. And then a ratio schedule can also be too lean that it causes what we call ratio strain. So something like an FR1000. So if I said I would give you, $50 after every, 20 questions you answered or practice questions you answered, that probably wouldn't be a problem. However, if I said that I would give you $20 after every 1 million questions you answered, I'd be causing ratio strain, meaning that you're not going to complete that ratio because it's so substantial, and that you're only going to get $20 after that is just not going to be worth it. So essentially it's going to function like extinction. There is a schedule of reinforcement in effect, but it's just too lean too thin to actually cause or to continue behavior. There are a couple of other schedules that sometimes creep up and can be quite relevant. Some of them are differential reinforcement of high rates of behavior. So these are basically where you're specifically reinforcing very fast responding, so that it's not just about how many times you respond, but also it's how fast you respond. So the faster you respond, the more food you get. And you can do the exact opposite, where you can reinforce very low rates, so that it has to be at least X period of time before your last response to be able to get a reinforcer. And these can be used to take behaviors that are happening too frequently and specifically reinforce them to only occur at very infrequent occurrences. And the differential reinforcement of high rates can occur when you need a particularly fast and quick behavior. Non-contingent reinforcement is basically two different types of schedules, fixed time or variable time. And what we mean by that is that it doesn't matter on behavior. So they're typically programmed ahead of the time based off of some type of time schedule. So fixed time means it doesn't matter it doesn't matter what you do, what behavior you engage in. There's no specific behavior that's required. Just every, say, if it's a fixed time, 30-second schedule, every 30 seconds, no matter what is happening in the world, food is delivered. Variable time schedule would be no matter what you are doing, food is delivered on average every 30 seconds. Sometimes it's after 10 seconds, sometimes it's after 60 seconds, but it doesn't matter what you're doing. So these types of schedules of reinforcement don't tend to support a particular type of behavior. Sometimes you can get what we call superstitious reinforcement, where you happen to be engaging in one behavior, you get a reinforcer. So you try it again, you get another reinforcer, you try it again, you get another reinforcer. And even though you're not being reinforced for that behavior, from the animal's perspective, it seems like you are. So sometimes that will occur, and we call that superstitious behavior. But nonetheless, non-contingent reinforcement is really designed to be like free reinforcers, regardless of the type of behavior that you're engaging in. Okay, so now let's go through a series of questions. So these will be questions that you can participate in. So Cindy is practicing her golf putting. On average, it takes her 4 putts before the ball goes in the hole. This is an example of a fixed ratio 4, variable ratio 4, fixed interval 4, variable interval 4, schedule of reinforcement. And the answer to this one is going to be, on average, it takes 4 putts. So on average means that it's not always the same. And does it go best of time, or does it go by behavior? So we know that it's on average is not always fixed, so it's got to be variable. And we know that it goes by the number of behaviors or responses made, not by the amount of time. So this would be a variable ratio schedule. So next, Sandra's mailbox is delivered every day at 10 o'clock. She checks her mailbox several times each morning, but only finds mail the very first time she checks after 10 o'clock, because obviously that's when the mailman comes. This is an example of fixed ratio 24 hours, fixed ratio, variable ratio 24 hours, fixed interval 24 hours, variable interval 24 hours. So first thing we want to know is it fixed or is it variable? And in this case, we'll just say that the mailman literally is 10 o'clock every single day. So in that case, we know that we need to focus on fixed. And then the question is it time-based or is it response-based? So in other words, if she checks it 1,000 times, is the mail going to come faster? No, it's not going to matter what her behavior is. So that tells us that it must be interval instead of fixed. So it would be a fixed interval schedule. So Frank sells jewelry to a local gift shop. Every time he completes 10 pairs of earrings, the shopkeeper pays him for them. This is an example of a, so is it fixed or variable? In this case, it would be fixed because it's exactly 10 pairs of earrings. And then is it a ratio? Does it depend on the amount of time things that he completes, or is it based off of time? And the answer is ratio. So this would be a fixed ratio 10 schedule. So Paul is an eager third grader and loves to be called on by his teacher. His schedule calls on him approximately once each period. Though Paul is never sure when his turn will come, this is an example of a blank schedule reinforcement. He's never sure when that turn will come, so that must mean that it is variable instead of fixed. And then secondly, is this time-based or is this response-based? So the teacher calls on him approximately once every period. So it's not, doesn't matter if he raises his hand 10 times or 20 times, but it's approximately once per period. So that's a period of time. So that would suggest that it is a variable interval schedule, which would be once per period. All right, so that wraps up our initial talks on schedules of reinforcement. And let us know if you have any questions.